The most dangerous thing about Raskolnikov is not that he committed a crime. The most dangerous thing is that his idea may have survived long after his failure. That sounds strange, doesn't it? After all, crime and punishment is usually remembered as a story about guilt, conscience, and redemption. A story where a man confronts the consequences of his choices. A story that seems to arrive at an answer. But what if that's not the real question? What if the deeper question is whether the idea at the center of Raskolnikov ever disappeared at all? Because ideas have a peculiar habit. People can reject them. Societies can condemn them. Authors can spend hundreds of pages arguing against them. And yet somehow those ideas keep finding new hosts. Raskolnikov is not important because of what he does. He is important because of what he represents. He represents a temptation. The temptation to believe that intelligence places a person above ordinary moral limits. The temptation to believe that certain individuals deserve exceptions. The temptation to believe that if the reasoning is sophisticated enough, the conscience can be negotiated with. And that is where the story becomes unsettling. Because the world did not leave that temptation behind in 19th century Russia. In many ways, it industrialized it. Look around today. How often do we hear some version of the same argument? A leader claiming that the goal justifies the method. A corporation insisting that the outcome matters more than the principle. An individual convincing themselves that a rule applies to everyone else, but not to them. Different language. Different century. The same temptation. And that's where Raskolnikov stops being a literary character and becomes something much larger. He becomes a symbol. A memory fragment buried inside modern culture. A young man in a cramped room, staring at an idea that promises freedom. An idea that whispers something seductive, perhaps morality is not a truth. Perhaps it is merely an obstacle. Perhaps extraordinary people are entitled to cross lines that ordinary people cannot. But here is the contradiction. If that idea is so obviously flawed, why does it keep returning? Why does every generation rediscover it? Why do highly educated people, successful people, even ethical people sometimes find themselves drawn toward the logic of self-justification? That question matters because the consequences extend far beyond literature. This is no longer about one character. It is about a pattern. A pattern that appears whenever human beings begin treating moral limits as inconveniences rather than realities. A pattern that emerges whenever intelligence becomes disconnected from humility. A pattern that transforms conscience from a guide into a problem that needs solving. And perhaps that is the first revelation hidden inside Dostoevsky's masterpiece. The true battle was never between one man and society. It was between an idea and the human soul. Because if guilt is merely a psychological glitch, it can be rationalized away. If morality is merely a social convention, it can be rewritten. If conscience is nothing more than conditioning, it can be overridden. But if those assumptions are wrong, then something much more profound is happening. Something that neither Raskolnikov nor the modern world has fully escaped. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe the real mystery of crime and punishment is not whether Raskolnikov found redemption. Maybe the real mystery is whether we still believe we can live without needing it. But there is an even deeper problem hidden beneath all of this. What if Raskolnikov's greatest mistake was not moral at all? What if it was psychological? Because when people discuss conscience, they often imagine a battle between good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and corruption. But that framework may actually conceal something more unsettling. The real conflict may not be between morality and immorality. It may be between reality and self-deception. And that changes everything. Because human beings rarely begin by wanting to do the wrong thing. Far more often, they begin by wanting a particular outcome. Then they construct a story that makes that outcome feel justified. That is why Raskolnikov remains so relevant. His role is not merely that of a rebel. He is the embodiment of a process. A process through which an idea slowly becomes more important than reality itself. Notice how dangerous that transformation is. The moment an idea becomes sacred, facts become negotiable. The moment a theory becomes part of someone's identity, contradiction starts feeling like an attack. And the moment a person believes they possess a higher understanding than everyone else, humility begins to disappear. This is where the conflict deepens. Because the question is no longer whether a person can break a moral rule. The question becomes whether a person can recognize that they are wrong after building their entire identity around being right. That is a much harder problem. And it reaches far beyond literature. A scientist can fall into it. A politician can fall into it. A business leader can fall into it. An ordinary person scrolling through social media can fall into it. The scale shifts from one individual to an entire civilization. Because civilizations are built from stories. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones people tell themselves. This brings us to one of the most important symbols in the entire project. Not a courtroom. Not a prison. Not even a specific event. A room. A cramped room. A narrow space where a single idea grows larger and larger until it begins to occupy the entire world. That image survives because it represents something universal. Everyone has such a room. Not physically. Mentally. A place where assumptions go unchallenged. A place where certainty echoes back and forth until it sounds like truth. A place where an idea can become so large that other human beings begin to disappear from view. And here lies the contradiction. The more convinced someone becomes of their intellectual independence, the more trapped they may actually be. Freedom transforms into captivity. Confidence transforms into isolation. The desire to rise above ordinary people creates distance from ordinary reality. That is why the project's central warning is becoming harder to ignore. The danger was never intelligence itself. The danger was intelligence disconnected from limits. Disconnected from self-doubt. Disconnected from the possibility that another person might see something we cannot. And once that separation occurs, something remarkable happens. Conscience no longer appears as a guide. It appears as an obstacle. Not because conscience changed, but because the individual did. This is the revelation hiding beneath the surface. The true threat is not the criminal mind. It is the rationalizing mind. The mind that can explain anything, defend anything, excuse anything, if given enough time. And perhaps that is why the story still refuses to stay in the 19th century. Because modern society has become extraordinarily good at producing explanations. Yet explanations and truth are not the same thing. In fact, the ability to explain ourselves may sometimes be the very thing that prevents us from seeing ourselves clearly. Which leads to an uncomfortable mystery. If human beings are capable of rationalizing almost anything, then how do we distinguish genuine moral insight from a story we simply want to believe? Before we can answer that question, we have to confront a possibility that is far more disturbing. What if the greatest threat to moral truth is not evil? What if it is certainty? That sounds backwards. Most people assume that dangerous individuals are driven by hatred, greed, cruelty, or malice. But history repeatedly presents a different pattern. Some of the most consequential decisions ever made were carried out by people who believed they were acting rationally. People who were convinced they understood reality better than everyone around them. And that is where the crisis hidden inside Raskolnikov begins to expand. Because his true role is not that of a criminal or a rebel. His role is that of a prototype. A prototype of what happens when intellectual confidence crosses an invisible line and transforms into moral exemption. Notice the contradiction. The stronger a person's belief in their own reasoning becomes, the less likely they are to question it. The less likely they are to question it, the more complete their internal logic appears. And the more complete that logic appears, the easier it becomes to dismiss every warning sign that comes from outside. This creates a strange paradox. The pursuit of truth can slowly become a defense against truth. That is the crisis. Not ignorance. Not irrationality. but the possibility that intelligence itself can become trapped inside a closed system. Think about what that means on a larger scale. A single individual trapped inside such a system is dangerous enough. An institution trapped inside such a system becomes far more dangerous. A culture trapped inside such a system can reshape an entire era. The scale has shifted again. We are no longer examining one mind. We are examining a recurring pattern of civilization. Because every age develops its own version of the same temptation. The temptation to believe that outcomes matter more than principles. The temptation to believe that exceptional circumstances require exceptional exemptions. The temptation to believe that moral limits are obstacles standing in the way of progress. And every time that temptation appears, it arrives wearing a different mask. Sometimes it calls itself necessity. Sometimes it calls itself efficiency. Sometimes it calls itself justice. Sometimes it even calls itself compassion. That is what makes it so difficult to recognize. The most dangerous ideas rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They present themselves as reasonable. This is where another memory fragment emerges. Not a courtroom. Not a philosophical argument. A mirror. Because the unsettling question is no longer whether we understand Raskolnikov. The unsettling question is whether we recognize pieces of him within ourselves. Every person has experienced moments when they wanted the conclusion before they examined the evidence. Every person has felt the desire to justify a choice rather than evaluate it. Every person has been tempted to place themselves at the center of the moral equation. The difference is usually one of degree, not category. And that realization creates an entirely new contradiction. If the impulse is universal, then the problem cannot belong exclusively to a single character. It belongs to human nature itself. Which means the conflict inside the novel may have been misunderstood from the beginning. Perhaps the central battle is not between guilt and innocence. Perhaps it is not even between reason and conscience. Perhaps the deeper battle is between two competing visions of what a human being actually is. One vision sees people as capable of constructing their own moral reality. The other insists that reality eventually confronts them whether they acknowledge it or not. And here the mystery becomes larger than any individual life. Because both visions continue to compete today. In universities. In governments. In corporations. In private decisions made behind closed doors. The argument never ended. It simply changed language. Which leads us to a revelation that remains unfinished. Maybe the most important question is not whether Raskolnikov was wrong. Maybe the more important question is why human beings continue to be drawn toward the very kind of thinking that was supposed to serve as a warning. And if that attraction is still alive, then perhaps there is something hidden beneath guilt itself that we have not yet uncovered. What if the reason people keep returning to this pattern is not because they reject morality, but because they are searching for something morality alone cannot provide? This is where a deeper revelation begins to emerge. The core temptation was never simply the desire to escape rules. It was the desire to become significant. Beneath the arguments, beneath the theories, beneath the elaborate justifications, there is a hunger that is far older than any philosophy. The hunger to matter. The hunger to believe that one's life carries extraordinary weight. And suddenly the central figure of this story appears in a very different light. Not as a symbol of rebellion alone, but as a symbol of a person attempting to solve an existential problem through an intellectual solution. That distinction changes everything. Because intellectual problems can often be solved by better information. Existential problems cannot. They involve identity, meaning, purpose, and worth. They involve questions that logic can describe but cannot satisfy. This is why the conflict becomes so profound. The more a person tries to answer questions of meaning through power, superiority, or self-created importance, the further they may drift from the thing they were actually seeking. Here another memory fragment emerges. Imagine a man standing in front of a mirror, not asking whether he is good or bad, but asking whether he is special enough to justify his existence. That image carries enormous weight because it extends far beyond a single character. Entire movements have been built upon the promise of significance. Entire ideologies have flourished by offering people a sense of exceptional destiny. Entire societies have convinced themselves that historical importance grants moral permission. The scale shifts once again. What begins as a personal struggle becomes a cultural force. What begins as an internal question becomes a collective temptation. And here lies the revelation that changes how we understand the conflict itself. The deepest divide may not be between reason and conscience. It may be between two competing answers to the question of human value. One answer says value must be earned through superiority, achievement, dominance, or exceptionality. The other says value exists before any of those things appear. If the first answer is true, then life becomes a constant competition for significance. If the second answer is true, then the entire pursuit changes direction. Suddenly the obsession with becoming extraordinary loses some of its power. Suddenly the need to stand above others begins to look less like strength and more like desperation. This helps explain a contradiction that has puzzled readers for generations. The central figure appears to be chasing freedom, yet becomes increasingly confined. Appears to be pursuing power, yet becomes increasingly fragile. Appears to be asserting independence, yet becomes increasingly controlled by the very idea he hoped would liberate him. The symbol of the cramped room returns here with greater meaning. It is no longer merely a physical space or even a psychological space. It becomes a spiritual space. A world that grows smaller and smaller as the self grows larger and larger. And perhaps that is the hidden consequence of every ideology centered entirely on the self. The individual believes they are expanding, while in reality their world is shrinking. But this revelation opens an even larger mystery. If the true struggle was never about rules, and never even about guilt, then what was Dostoevsky actually trying to diagnose? What was the deeper illness hiding beneath the obsession with becoming extraordinary, and why does that illness seem even more visible in the modern world than it did in his own? What was the deeper illness? The answer may be far simpler, and far more uncomfortable, than most readers expect. The deepest revelation is not that a human being can justify wrongdoing. Human beings have always done that. The deeper revelation is that the desire to become extraordinary can quietly replace the desire to become truthful. And once that substitution occurs, everything else begins to reorganize itself around a false center. This is the point where the entire structure suddenly comes into focus. The central figure was never merely pursuing freedom, power, significance, or intellectual superiority. Those were surface expressions of something deeper. What he was truly pursuing was exemption. Exemption from limitation. Exemption from ordinary humanity. Exemption from the conditions that bind every other person. This is why he functions as such a powerful archetype. He is not the archetype of evil. He is the archetype of self-transcendence pursued in the wrong direction. That distinction matters because it transforms the meaning of the entire conflict. Most people assume the story asks whether human beings should obey moral rules. But the deeper question is whether human beings can remain fully human while attempting to rise above humanity itself. That is a very different problem. And it reveals why the pursuit becomes self-defeating. The moment someone begins treating ordinary human limits as evidence of weakness, they also begin rejecting the very things that make meaningful life possible. Vulnerability. Interdependence. Humility. Compassion. The ability to be corrected. The ability to belong. Here another memory fragment emerges. Not a rebellious thinker standing above the crowd. A lone figure standing on an empty platform after everyone else has left. Because the final destination of self-exemption is often isolation. Not physical isolation alone, but existential isolation. A condition in which the individual can no longer participate in a shared moral reality. This is where the symbol of the story becomes larger than the character. The true prison is not punishment. The true prison is separation. Separation from other people. Separation from truth. Separation from the ability to receive meaning rather than manufacture it. And suddenly a remarkable inversion takes place. What initially appears to be strength begins to look like fragility. What initially appears to be independence begins to look like dependence on an idea. What initially appears to be liberation begins to resemble captivity. This may be the insight most readers overlook. The tragedy is not that a person breaks away from society. The tragedy is that a person breaks away from reality itself. Once that happens, every achievement becomes unstable because it must constantly be defended by further justification. Every certainty becomes fragile because it cannot tolerate contradiction. Every identity becomes exhausted because it must continually prove its own importance. The scale now expands beyond literature entirely. Entire ideologies can fall into this trap. Entire institutions can fall into this trap. Entire civilizations can begin organizing themselves around narratives of exceptionality, superiority, or historical destiny. And when that happens, the consequences extend across generations. This is why the story continues to feel modern. It is not describing a historical moment. It is exposing a permanent vulnerability within human nature. A vulnerability that appears whenever significance becomes more important than truth. And that leads us to the consequence that will shape everything that follows. If the deepest danger is not wrongdoing itself but the desire to place oneself beyond ordinary human limits, then the most important question is no longer what happens to an individual who embraces that temptation. The more important question is what happens to a society when millions of people begin doing the same thing at once. What happens when an entire society begins treating self-exemption as a virtue rather than a danger? The answer is not found in a single event, a single institution, or a single historical period. The answer appears gradually, almost invisibly, in the way people learn to think. Because the ultimate consequence of the pattern we have been exploring is not destruction. It is fragmentation. Fragmentation of truth. Fragmentation of meaning. Fragmentation of the shared moral reality that allows individuals to live together without constantly reinventing the rules of existence. This is the legacy that extends far beyond any one character. The character functions as a warning, but the warning survives because it points toward something permanent. Every generation inherits the temptation to place personal judgment above every external standard. Every generation inherits the temptation to believe that intelligence alone can serve as a sufficient compass. And every generation discovers the same problem. Intelligence can explain where we want to go. It cannot always explain why we should go there. This is where the long-term consequence becomes visible. Once societies lose confidence in any truth larger than the individual self, disagreement slowly transforms into isolation. Not because people stop talking, but because they stop sharing the same foundation. One person builds reality on utility. Another builds it on power. Another builds it on emotion. Another builds it on personal experience. The conversation continues, but the common language begins to disappear. Here another memory fragment emerges. Not a courtroom. Not a prison. Not even a lonely room. A bridge collapsing from both sides at the same time. Each group believes it is moving toward understanding, yet the distance between them grows wider with every step. This is one reason the legacy of this story feels surprisingly modern. The warning is not about what happens when people become irrational. The warning is about what happens when countless competing forms of rationality attempt to replace a shared understanding of truth. The scale expands again. What begins inside one mind eventually reshapes institutions. Institutions reshape culture. Culture reshapes generations. Generations reshape history. And yet the original conflict remains unchanged. Human beings continue asking whether they are discoverers of meaning or creators of meaning. Whether moral reality exists independently of them or depends entirely upon them. Whether conscience is a guide to something real or merely an internal preference. These questions did not remain inside literature. They escaped into philosophy, politics, psychology, technology, and everyday life. That is the true legacy. Not a character. Not an argument. A question that refuses to die. And perhaps that explains why the story continues to attract readers more than a century later. The central figure is no longer merely a person within a novel. He has become a recurring human possibility. A pattern that appears whenever people begin believing they can stand outside the conditions that make them human. A pattern that appears whenever significance becomes detached from responsibility. A pattern that appears whenever the desire to be exceptional becomes stronger than the willingness to be truthful. Yet there is one final consequence that remains unresolved. The more modern society celebrates autonomy, self-definition, and individual authority, the more urgent the original question becomes. Because if every person becomes their own ultimate source of meaning, judgment, and truth, what happens when those truths collide? And more importantly, is the resulting conflict evidence of human freedom reaching its highest form, or evidence that something essential has been lost along the way? Perhaps that is why this story has never truly belonged to its own century. Most novels are remembered because they capture a particular time, a particular culture, a particular set of circumstances. But some works endure because they identify a tension that never disappears. They uncover something that follows human beings wherever they go. And in the end, that may be the deepest insight hidden beneath everything we have explored. The central figure was never important because he represented one person. He remains important because he represents a question. A question that emerges whenever people attempt to build their lives upon themselves alone. Not because self-reliance is wrong. Not because reason is dangerous. Not because ambition is inherently destructive. But because there is a point beyond which the self becomes too small to carry the weight it places upon itself. That is the image that remains after everything else fades away. Not a theory. Not an argument. A solitary figure inside a narrowing room, trying to support an entire universe of meaning with nothing but his own mind. The image is unforgettable because it reflects a possibility that exists within all of us. Every generation inherits extraordinary tools. More information. More knowledge. More freedom. More opportunities to define identity and purpose. Yet the modern world also places an unprecedented burden on the individual. The burden of deciding who to be, what to believe, what matters, what is true, and why life has meaning. For many people, that freedom feels empowering. For others, it feels overwhelming. And perhaps that is where the story continues to speak with such force. It reminds us that the crisis of meaning is not solved simply by increasing choice, increasing knowledge, or increasing autonomy. Human beings do not merely need explanations. They need orientation. They need a way of locating themselves within a reality larger than their own desires, fears, and ambitions. This is why the strongest memory fragments remain so powerful. The mirror. The collapsing bridge. The narrowing room. The lone figure seeking exemption from ordinary human limits. None of these images are ultimately about one character. They are images of a recurring human temptation. The temptation to believe that significance can replace truth. The temptation to believe that intelligence can replace wisdom. The temptation to believe that standing above others is the same thing as transcending oneself. Yet the lasting legacy of the story may point in the opposite direction. Not upward toward exceptionality, but outward toward relationship. Not toward domination, but toward participation. Not toward escaping the human condition, but toward accepting it. There is something profoundly paradoxical about that conclusion. The more desperately people seek to become extraordinary, the more isolated they often become. Yet many of the deepest forms of meaning seem to emerge not from separation, but from connection. Not from exemption, but from belonging. And perhaps that is why the story refuses to provide a final, comfortable answer. Because the question at its heart was never simply about guilt, morality, or redemption. It was about what kind of creature a human being truly is. A self-creating individual accountable only to personal judgment. Or a being whose freedom becomes meaningful only when it recognizes something beyond itself. More than a century later, that question remains unresolved. It waits quietly beneath politics, beneath culture, beneath philosophy, beneath personal identity. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the answer does not determine how we read the story. Perhaps it determines how we choose to live our own lives. And if that is true, then the real mystery was never whether one man could escape the consequences of his ideas. The real mystery is whether any of us can build a meaningful life without eventually confronting the limits of ourselves.